The old Capitol building stood like a silent sentinel in the middle of the city, its once proud pillars cracked and crumbling. Decades of political scandals had stained its walls, but the real horror lay in the dark secrets buried beneath the floor. Agent Mark Vance stood outside the wrought iron gates, staring up at the building. His team had been called here by the highest levels of government, following the sudden disappearance of a senator during a routine meeting in the Capitol's underground chambers. The media was told he had resigned unexpectedly, but Vance knew better. The air was thick with tension as Vance and his team approached the entrance. The team was new, brought together for this mission due to their unique skills. Sam, the sharp-witted skeptic, had joined reluctantly, only here to prove ghosts didn't exist. Ava, their tech expert, clutched her ghost-hunting equipment, checking her EMF detector for spikes. Lila, a psychic medium, trailed behind, her face pale as she absorbed the energy of the place. "There's something old here," Lila whispered, breaking the silence. "Something that has waited a long time to be free." Sam snorted. "You always say that. Let's not jump to conclusions just yet." As the team entered the building, the temperature dropped. Their breaths misted in the air. Vance exchanged a look with Ava, who shrugged and continued to scan the area with her equipment. The main hall was empty, but echoes of footsteps bounced off the marble floors. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt like the walls themselves were watching. Ava's EMF detector began to beep erratically. "We've got something," she muttered, eyes wide. The device pointed them toward a massive oak door at the end of a long hallway. Inside the room, they found an ancient altar covered in dust and strange, arcane symbols carved into the stone. Lila gasped as her fingers brushed against the surface, pulling her hand back as if burned. "I can feel it. This is where it happened. The ritual that cursed this place." Before Vance could ask what she meant, the room grew darker, the shadows swirling unnaturally around them. Then they heard it, a low, guttural growl from the far corner of the room. The growl wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. Suddenly, the room erupted in chaos. Crawlers, deformed creatures with elongated limbs and twisted faces, emerged from the shadows, skittering across the walls and ceiling. Their grotesque forms contorted as they approached, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Fall back!" Vance shouted, but it was too late. One of the crawlers lunged at Sam, who barely managed to dodge. Its claws raked the floor, leaving deep grooves in the stone. Ava activated her equipment, a high-frequency pulse designed to disrupt spiritual entities. The crawlers screeched, momentarily disoriented, but it wasn't enough to stop them. Lila stood frozen, her eyes wide in terror as the creatures closed in. "They're feeding off the energy in this room," Lila cried. "We need to get out of here now." The team bolted for the door, narrowly avoiding the snapping jaws and slashing claws of the crawlers. As they reached the hallway, the growls faded, but the building seemed to groan in displeasure, as if it was alive and hungry. "That wasn't a simple haunting," Vance said, catching his breath. "We're dealing with something far more dangerous." Lila nodded, her face pale. They were summoned, and they're just the beginning. Back in their makeshift command center, a room they'd secured in one of the Capitol's abandoned offices, the team tried to regroup. The air still buzzed with tension, and the encounter with the crawlers left them on edge. Sam paced the room, rubbing the fresh scratch marks on his arm. "That wasn't a hallucination, was it? Those things were real." "Unfortunately," Ava said, still scanning the readouts from her equipment. "Whatever's in this building, it's feeding on the energy of the past. The history here is dark. This is no ordinary haunting." Lila sat quietly in the corner, her hands trembling. She had felt the presence of something else in the room, something darker and more ancient than the crawlers. But before she could voice her fears, the lights in the room flickered, then went out completely. "Great, just what we need," Sam muttered, fumbling for his flashlight. The darkness was complete, swallowing even the faintest glimmers of light. "Everyone stay together," Vance ordered. His voice was calm, but tension rippled through the group. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the darkness, a dragging, scraping noise, like heavy chains being pulled across the floor. It was coming from the hallway. "Did anyone else hear that?" Ava whispered, her voice tight. The sound grew louder, and then they saw it. A tall, faceless figure emerging from the blackness. It was the Shadow Man, an entity they had heard whispers of but never seen. The figure was impossibly tall, its form stretching into the ceiling, and its head, or lack thereof, seemed to absorb all light around it. Lila gasped. That's him, the one they summoned to protect the capital. It's the Shadow Man. The Shadow Man began to glide toward them, the air around it growing colder with every step. Vance could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Get out! Vance shouted, pushing the team toward the door, but the Shadow Man was already upon them. It reached out a long, shadowy arm brushing against Sam's back. Sam screamed and collapsed, his body convulsing as the Shadow Man's touch sapped the life from him. The team scrambled to pull Sam away from the Shadow Man, but its touch had left him limp and pale, as though the life was draining from his body. Ava quickly grabbed her thermal camera and swung it toward the looming figure, hoping to capture something, anything, about what they were facing. Back up. Now, Vance shouted, tugging Sam's unconscious form toward the door. His own voice felt distant, swallowed by the oppressive energy of the Shadow Man. The air around them vibrated, the darkness seeping into every corner of the room. Lila, her breath coming in short gasps, began to chant under her breath, her fingers drawing protective symbols in the air. Stay away, she muttered, her voice laced with panic. She could feel the weight of the entity pressing down on her psyche, as if it was trying to get inside her mind. Ava's equipment beeped wildly, overwhelmed by the energy surge. This thing, it's not just a ghost, she whispered, wide-eyed. It's something else, something ancient. With a burst of strength, Vance managed to pull Sam through the door and into the hallway. The moment they crossed the threshold, the oppressive weight lifted slightly, though the chill remained. The Shadow Man stopped at the edge of the room, hovering as if bound by an invisible barrier. We're safe for now, Vance breathed, setting Sam gently against the wall. But we can't stay here. Sam groaned, his eyes fluttering open. His skin was clammy, and his breath came in shallow gasps. What was that thing? He croaked, barely able to speak. The Shadow Man, Lila said quietly, her voice trembling. He's the guardian of this place, summoned long ago, bound to protect whatever dark secret the capital hides. But why attack us? Ava asked, glancing nervously toward the room where the entity still lurked. We haven't done anything. Lila shook her head. It doesn't care. It feeds on fear, on life. It's drawn to the energy we're giving off. Vance stood, his mind racing. We need to figure out what's keeping it here, and how to stop it. Lila, can you get any more from the spirits here? Something that can help us. Lila hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. There's something else here. I've been hearing voices, whispers in the walls. They're not human. Before anyone could ask her to explain, the building shook, the vibrations causing dust and debris to fall from the ceiling. From deep within the capital, a chorus of eerie voices rose, chanting, singing, as if hundreds of voices were speaking in unison. The others, Lila gasped, clutching her head as if in pain. They're waking up. Others? Ava asked, her voice trembling. What others? Spirits, demons, things that were summoned here long ago, Lila murmured, her eyes distant. They're trapped in this place, bound by rituals and blood. And now, something's stirring them awake. Vance exchanged a worried glance with Ava. We need to get to the source of this before they come for us. As the voices grew louder, the team knew they had no choice but to push forward, deeper into the capital's hidden chambers. Sam, though still weak, managed to stand with Vance's help, and together they moved toward the stairwell that led into the heart of the building's underbelly. Every step was accompanied by the sound of whispers, faint, disembodied voices that seemed to echo from the very walls. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the smell of decay filled their lungs. This place is a tomb, Ava muttered, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows along the stairwell. We shouldn't be here. Vance nodded grimly. But we have no choice. The underground passageways beneath the capital were a maze of crumbling brick walls and rotting wood beams. The team's footsteps echoed hollowly in the damp air, the only sound apart from the constant hum of the unseen voices. Every corner felt like it hid something watching them, something waiting. Lila clutched her head, her face pale and drawn. I can feel them, so many souls. They're trapped down here. Is there any way to communicate with them? Vance asked, glancing over his shoulder at her. Lila nodded weakly. I can try, but it's dangerous. These aren't just ghosts. They're twisted, angry. As they moved deeper into the bowels of the building, the voices grew more distinct, and with them came a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a great dark heart. The sound reverberated through the walls, growing louder with each step. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber, dimly lit by flickering, ancient lanterns. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, covered in centuries-old bloodstains. Around it, broken chains dangled from the ceiling, and the floor was littered with the remnants of bones, some human, others too twisted and malformed to identify. This is where it all began, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of voices. The rituals, the sacrifices. This is where they bound the demons. Ava scanned the room with her EMF reader, the device spiking off the charts. This place is a nexus of paranormal energy. Whatever happened here, it's not over. Suddenly, the room filled with a bone-chilling wail, a sound of pure agony. The shadows around them thickened, coalescing into the forms of twisted, deformed spirits. Their faces were contorted in eternal torment, their hollow eyes fixed on the team. Run! Vance shouted, but the spirits surged forward, their wails echoing off the stone walls. Sam, still weak from his encounter with the Shadow Man, stumbled and fell, only to be dragged toward the altar by invisible hands. The spirits converged on him, their spectral fingers clawing at his body. "Help me!" he screamed, but the spirits were too strong. Vance grabbed his gun, useless as it might be against the supernatural, and fired blindly at the spirits. To his shock, the bullets didn't pass through them. They tore into their ethereal forms, causing them to shriek and dissipate. "They're not invincible," Vance yelled, reloading his weapon. "We can fight them." But even as they fought, the thumping grew louder, and the ground began to shake. Something much larger, much older, was waking beneath the Capitol, and it was hungry. The rumbling beneath the Capitol grew more intense as the team struggled to hold off the spirits. With every second, it felt like the ground would split open and swallow them whole. Sam, still writhing on the floor, was barely able to fend off the spectral hands that tugged at his legs. His face was pale, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Hold on!" Vance shouted, rushing over to Sam and blasting another spirit with his gun. It screamed and disintegrated, but more kept coming, endless, relentless. "We can't stay here," Ava yelled, her voice nearly drowned out by the howling of the spirits. She reloaded her weapon, the flashlight on her gear flickering as the energy in the room seemed to drain all their devices. Lila, her eyes closed and her lips moving silently, suddenly fell to her knees. She was murmuring in a language none of them understood, her fingers tracing symbols in the air. Sweat poured down her face as her body shook violently. "Lila," Vance called, glancing over. "What are you doing?" "I'm trying to connect to the spirits," she gasped, her voice strained. "They're trapped here, bound to the demons. If I can reach them, maybe." The floor beneath them gave a tremendous lurch, throwing them all off balance. The stone altar in the center of the room began to glow with an eerie, blood-red light, illuminating the chamber in a sickening hue. From the cracks in the ground, black smoke rose, swirling like a living thing. Sam, his body now limp, was dragged closer to the altar, the smoke coiling around his arms and legs. His eyes rolled back in his head as a low, guttural moan escaped his throat. "No!" Ava screamed, rushing forward, but she was knocked back by an unseen force, crashing into the wall with a bone-jarring thud. Vance, with every ounce of strength, grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him back. The smoke writhed in fury, but Vance's grip was iron. He wasn't going to lose another team member. Suddenly, the ground cracked open at the base of the altar, and a monstrous figure began to rise. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a hulking demonic shape, its skin as black as night, eyes glowing with molten fire. Its mouth was a twisted grin, filled with razor-sharp teeth, and from its back sprouted skeletal wings. Lila's chanting grew louder, more desperate. Her hands were trembling, her eyes locked on the rising demon. It's too late," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Vance shouted, pulling Sam to his feet. "We don't leave anyone behind. We fight." The demon, fully emerged from the pit, let out a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the building. The spirits that had been attacking them recoiled, retreating into the shadows as their master appeared. Ava, clutching her injured arm, looked at Vance with fear in her eyes. "What do we do?" Vance gritted his teeth, the fear gnawing at his gut. "We survive, and we stop this thing before it destroys everything." The demon's eyes fixed on them, its grin widening. It stepped forward, its massive claws leaving gouges in the stone floor as it moved. Sam, now conscious but weak, looked up at the demon, his voice barely a whisper. "We're not prepared for this." Vance raised his weapon, though he knew it would do little against the creature before them. "We're never prepared, but we adapt." As the demon lunged toward them, its wings spreading wide, the team braced for the fight of their lives. The demon's claws sliced through the air with a speed that defied its hulking size. Vance barely managed to roll out of the way, feeling the searing heat radiating from the creature's body. It was like standing next to an open furnace, the very air around it warping with its hellish energy. Ava, her injured arm hanging limply at her side, pulled out a flare from her pack. If bullets don't work, maybe this will slow it down. She ignited the flare and threw it at the demon's feet. The room erupted in a burst of crimson light as the flare hissed and sparked. The demon screeched, recoiling slightly from the bright light, but it wasn't enough to deter it for long. Its glowing eyes locked onto Ava, and with a swift, predatory movement, it lunged toward her. Lila, still deep in her trance, suddenly snapped her eyes open. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of grim determination. "It's feeding off the fear. If we give in, it'll only get stronger." "We need a plan," Vance shouted, barely dodging another swipe from the demon's claws. "There's a way," Lila said, standing shakily to her feet. "But it's dangerous. If I can break the bond between the demon and the spirits, it'll weaken it. But I'll need time." Sam, still unsteady on his feet, looked at Vance. "Time we don't have. Then we make it," Vance growled. "Ava, keep that thing busy. Sam, get ready to grab Lila if anything goes wrong." Ava nodded, her face set in determination. She ignited another flare and waved it at the demon, drawing its attention. "Come on, you ugly bastard. Over here." The demon turned its fiery gaze toward her, its wings spreading wide as it let out another bone-rattling roar. It stalked toward Ava, its massive claws raking the ground as it went. Lila began chanting again, her voice rising above the chaos of the battle. Her hands moved in intricate patterns, the air around her shimmering with energy. The spirits in the room seemed to pause, their wailing subsiding as Lila's magic took hold. The demon, sensing the shift, turned its attention toward Lila. Its eyes narrowed, and with a speed that defied its size, it lunged toward her, its claws outstretched. "No!" Vance shouted, firing his weapon at the demon's head. The bullets sparked off its skin, but it was enough to distract it for a moment. Lila's chanting grew louder, more intense. The air in the room crackled with energy, and the spirits began to swirl around her, drawn to her power. The demon let out a furious screech, its form flickering as if it was being torn between two worlds. "It's working!" Lila cried out, her voice strained with effort. "But I need more time." The demon, now desperate, flailed wildly, its claws slashing through the air as it tried to reach Lila. Ava threw another flare, the light temporarily blinding the creature, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Vance rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're almost there," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Just hold on." As the demon let out one final, earth-shaking roar, Lila's chant reached its climax, and the bond between the spirits and the demon shattered with a deafening crack. The creature's form flickered violently before collapsing into a cloud of black smoke. The battle was far from over, but for the moment they had won. The silence that followed the demon's vanishing was heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the room. The oppressive heat still lingered, and the smell of sulfur stung their noses. Vance stood over the spot where the demon had collapsed, his mind racing. This wasn't over. They all felt it. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and strained. "Whatever that was, it's coming back." Ava, leaning against the wall, wiped blood from a cut on her forehead. "I thought we had it. What else could possibly come after us?" Lila, pale and trembling, looked up from the symbols she had drawn on the floor. "The spirits, they're still here, but they're afraid. Something else is controlling them. Something worse than the demon." "What could be worse than that?" Sam asked, shakily standing up. His legs still felt weak, the effects of the demon's energy lingering in his body. Lila shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know, but I can feel it. It's ancient and angry. We're in its territory now." The floor beneath them rumbled again, softer this time, like a warning. Vance motioned for the team to follow as he led them out of the chamber. The eerie, red light from the altar had faded, but the atmosphere of the capital was darker, heavier. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Every gust of wind whispered secrets. As they made their way down the narrow, crumbling corridor, Ava noticed strange markings on the walls. They were symbols, twisted, dark runes that seemed to pulse with life. "What are these?" she asked, running her fingers over one. It was cold, almost icy to the touch. Lila stopped and inspected them closely, her expression darkening. These weren't here before. Someone or something marked this place. "It's a trap." "A trap for who?" Sam asked, swallowing hard. "For us," Vance muttered. "We're being herded." As they moved deeper into the capital's bowels, the air grew colder. Their breath puffed out in small clouds, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. The once grand and historical building now felt like a tomb, and the team's flashlights flickered as if the dark itself was draining their power. Suddenly, the corridor opened into a wide, circular room. It was the capital's basement, a forgotten space that hadn't been touched in years. Dust hung thick in the air, and broken furniture littered the ground. But that wasn't what caught their attention. In the center of the room stood a figure, motionless and cloaked in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs too long to be human. Its face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and the edges of its coat seemed to dissolve into the darkness. "The Shadow Man," Ava gasped, stepping back, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. "What the hell?" "Stay calm," Vance warned, holding out his hand. "We don't know what it wants." The figure didn't move, but the temperature plummeted further. The room felt suffocating, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on them. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that seemed to slither into their minds, cold and oily. "You're too late," it whispered. "The gates are open. You cannot stop what's coming." Lila shuddered, clutching her head as the voice wormed its way into her thoughts. "Get out of my mind," she hissed through gritted teeth. The Shadow Man tilted its head, watching them with unseen eyes. "You are mere pawns in a game far older than you. The true master will rise, and when he does, all will burn." Vance aimed his gun at the figure, his hand steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath their feet began to crack, jagged fissures snaking across the floor, glowing with an unnatural light. From the cracks, dark tendrils of smoke rose, coiling and writhing like serpents. "Back up!" Sam shouted, but it was too late. The tendrils shot out, wrapping around their legs, pulling them toward the center of the room. The air filled with the stench of decay and sulfur as the floor beneath them split open wider, revealing a pit of blackness, bottomless and cold. Lila screamed as one of the tendrils wrapped around her neck, dragging her closer to the edge. Vance grabbed her, pulling with all his strength, but the force of the tendrils was too strong. "We're not going down like this," Vance shouted, firing his weapon into the darkness. The Shadow Man simply watched, unmoving, as the team was pulled closer to the pit. "The master will have your souls," it whispered. As the ground cracked open beneath them, it became clear that they had been lured into a trap far beyond their understanding. Vance's hands were slick with sweat as he pulled against the tendrils dragging Lila toward the abyss. Every time he thought he had a grip, the smoky coils tightened, burning his skin like acid. Ava, firing her weapon wildly, managed to hit one of the tendrils snaking around her own legs. The bullet seemed to have no effect, passing straight through the smoke as if it wasn't even there. "This isn't working," she yelled. "We need to figure out what these things are." Lila, her voice choking as the tendril squeezed her throat, gasped out, "They're not physical there." Her words cut off in a strangled cry as the tendril yanked her closer to the pit. Sam, clutching a flare, ignited it and tossed it toward the tendrils. The light flared brightly in the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tendrils recoiled slightly, giving them a brief moment of respite. "It hates the light," Sam realized, his voice shaky. "We need more light." Vance, his mind racing, scanned the room. There was nothing, just broken furniture and the oppressive darkness. But then he remembered the Capitol's old electrical system. If they could reactivate the emergency lights, it might be enough to buy them time. Ava, Sam, get to the control room. Find the backup generator and get those lights on. Vance barked, not taking his eyes off the Shadow Man. It stood at the edge of the room, watching them with an eerie patience, as if it knew this was only the beginning. Ava hesitated, glancing at Lila, who was still struggling against the tendrils. "We can't just leave her." "Go," Vance snapped. "I'll hold them off." Reluctantly, Ava and Sam dashed out of the room, disappearing down the dark hallway. The sound of their footsteps echoed ominously, fading into the distance. Vance turned back to Lila, gripping her hand tightly. "I'm not letting you go." The pit below them pulsed with a sickly red light, and the air around them seemed to grow thicker, heavier. The tendrils were relentless, tightening their grip with each passing second. Lila's eyes fluttered as the tendrils constricted her throat, cutting off her air. She tried to speak, to warn Vance about the ancient force lurking beneath them, but the words wouldn't come. The Shadow Man, still unmoving, spoke again, its voice crawling into Vance's mind. "She belongs to the abyss now. Soon you will too." Vance gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. "Not today." With a final, desperate yank, he pulled Lila free from the tendrils, both of them collapsing to the floor. The tendrils recoiled, retreating into the cracks in the floor. The pit's glow dimmed, but it wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time. The Shadow Man's laughter echoed through the room as the ground trembled again. Time was running out. The moment Vance pulled Lila away from the pit, the floor buckled beneath them. Tremors shook the old Capitol building, as if the structure was groaning in pain. The ancient evil buried beneath its foundations had finally awoken. Lila coughed, struggling to regain her breath. "Vance, it's not just the Shadow Man. There's something worse down there. Something that's been sealed for centuries. If it gets out..." "I know." Vance's voice was grim, his gaze locked on the widening cracks that pulsed with a faint, unnatural light. The tendrils had retreated, but the pit continued to beckon, like a gaping mouth waiting to devour them. "We need to get those lights on, or we're done for." Suddenly, the ground shook again, more violently this time. The walls creaked, and debris fell from the ceiling as cracks snaked up the walls. Vance could feel the dark energy seeping through the air, clinging to his skin like tar. Whatever was down there, it was coming. Ava's voice crackled through the walkie. "Vance, we're at the control room. There's a backup generator, but it's ancient. We're trying to get it running." Vance glanced toward the exit. "Make it quick. We don't have much time." But before he could say more, a deep, guttural growl echoed from the pit. The sound vibrated through the floor, sending chills down his spine. Slowly, a figure began to rise from the abyss. It wasn't the Shadow Man. It was something far worse. The creature that emerged was monstrous, towering over them with twisted, sinewy limbs and skin that seemed to shift between shadow and solid form. Its face, if it could be called that, was a grotesque mass of eyes and teeth, constantly shifting and writhing. The demon had returned, but now it was fully unleashed. Lila staggered to her feet, fear etched across her face. "That's it. The thing that's been controlling everything." Vance pulled his gun, though he knew it would be useless. "We need to stall it until Sam and Ava can get those lights on." The demon let out a deafening roar, its eyes locking onto them. As it moved, the very air around it warped, as if reality itself was bending to its will. The Tendrils of smoke and shadow spiraled around its body, lashing out at everything in sight. The building's walls began to splinter, beams cracking under the pressure. "Vance!" Ava's voice rang out over the walkie. "The generator's on, but we need more time to get the emergency lights working." "We don't have more time," Vance shouted as the demon lunged toward them, its massive claws tearing through the floor. He grabbed Lila and dove to the side just in time to avoid being crushed. Lila scrambled to her feet, clutching the ghost hunting equipment. "I have an idea, but it's risky." "Risky's all we've got," Vance replied. She quickly adjusted the settings on one of the devices, a high-frequency ghost box designed to amplify paranormal energy. "If we overload this thing, it might disrupt the demon's hold on this place, but it could also destroy us in the process." "Do it," Vance ordered. "Better to go down fighting." Lila flipped the switch, and the device whined to life, emitting a high-pitched hum that grew louder by the second. The air vibrated with energy as the machine drew power from the dark forces surrounding them. The demon recoiled, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. Its roar of rage shook the building to its core. The tendrils lashed out, but they were weaker now, less coordinated. "Keep it going," Vance urged as he fired uselessly at the creature, his bullets passing through its shifting form. The demon lunged again, but this time its movements were slower, as though the very essence of the capital was resisting it. As Lila's overloaded ghost box hummed, the capital felt like it was coming apart at the seams. Each rumble of the ground, each crack of the walls, made the building feel more like a collapsing tomb than a historical monument. But the real terror was the demon. It struggled, lashing out wildly as if it could sense its grip slipping. Outside, a faint flicker of light glowed from the emergency system Ava and Sam had been working on. The flicker was weak, barely illuminating the hallway, but it was a start. "Vance, we've got the generator running, but it's going to take a minute for the lights to stabilize." Ava's voice came through the walkie, strained and anxious. Vance gritted his teeth, dodging another swipe of the demon's claws. "We don't have a minute." Suddenly, from the far side of the room, Sam burst through the door, dragging a floodlight in his arms. "I found this in the storeroom. Hope it's enough." Without waiting for a response, he set it up and pointed it directly at the demon. He flipped the switch, and the floodlight flared to life, casting a harsh, blinding beam into the center of the room. The demon screeched, a sound so piercing it shook the air. Its form flickered violently, distorting between shadow and substance. The light seemed to tear at its very essence, unraveling the darkness that composed it. "It's working," Lila shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and relief. But the demon wasn't finished. With a final desperate surge, it lunged at the team, its enormous clawed hand reaching for Sam. Vance moved instinctively, tackling Sam out of the way just as the claw smashed into the floor, splintering the concrete. "Stay behind the light," Vance ordered as he pulled Sam to his feet. The demon writhed, flailing as the floodlight burned into it. Dark smoke poured from its body, filling the air with the stench of rot and sulfur. Ava and Lila joined Sam behind the floodlight, watching in horrified awe as the demon's form began to disintegrate. Its limbs twisted and contorted, its claws shrinking as the light consumed it. "Lila, the ghost box," Vance called out, pointing to the humming device still whirring on the ground. Lila nodded, scrambling to the machine and cranking it to its maximum setting. The high-pitched hum grew deafening, and the air vibrated with energy. The combination of the light and the amplified paranormal energy was tearing the demon apart. With one last unearthly scream, the demon's form exploded in a burst of dark smoke. The tendrils evaporated, and the ground stopped shaking. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the floodlight and the steady hum of the ghost box. For a moment, none of them moved, as if waiting for something else to happen. Then, slowly, the oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted. The capital felt empty. "It's over," Lila whispered, collapsing to her knees in exhaustion. Vance looked around the room, his heart still pounding. The pit had sealed itself, and the cracks in the floor had disappeared. Whatever ancient evil had been buried beneath the capital was gone, or at least driven back. But as the team caught their breath, Sam pointed to the far corner of the room. What's that? In the shadows, something moved, small, quick, like a flash of black darting out of sight. Vance frowned, grabbing his flashlight. Don't tell me. A whisper echoed through the room, faint and distant. We are never truly gone. Vance switched off his flashlight and turned to the team. Let's get the hell out of here. And as they left the Capitol behind, the ancient halls seemed to sigh, a dark promise that the evil wasn't finished with them yet.